Survival was a science, not luck, not chance, not the favor of gods or fate. Science, repeatable, predictable, a series of calculated decisions made under extreme pressure that separated the living from the corpses. HUNK had spent his entire career proving this theorem across dozens of missions that killed everyone else. Raccoon City, Rockfort Island, countless Black Ops operations where the objective was simple: retrieve the sample, survive the outbreak, return for extraction. While others panicked, screamed, begged, HUNK moved through bioweapon hellscapes with the cold efficiency of a machine. They called him the Grim Reaper, not because he killed, but because he was the only one who walked out when death came calling. Now death had made a miscalculation. The Umbrella Corporation's dimensional research facility was supposed to be an escape route, a way to sidestep international tribunals and criminal prosecution by literally fleeing to another reality. HUNK's mission: retrieve the experimental T-virus variant samples from the unstable lab, eliminate witnesses, extract before the dimensional gateway collapsed. Standard parameters, achievable objectives. He'd completed the first two. The third became complicated when the gateway destabilized during his extraction, pulling him through a rupture in space-time that his rational mind couldn't process. One moment he was in the Umbrella facility, bioweapon case secured. The next, he was tumbling through a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and sensations that would have driven a weaker mind into catatonic shock. HUNK compartmentalized the experience, focused on immediate priorities, maintain grip on the case, protect vital organs, prepare for impact on unknown terrain. He crashed into an ocean during a storm. The impact should have killed him, would have killed anyone else. But HUNK's body, enhanced through years of bioweapon exposure, mutagen resistance, and sheer adaptive evolution, absorbed trauma that would shatter normal human physiology. He surfaced in black water, rain hammering down from a sky illuminated by strange lightning. The case remained sealed, magnetically locked to his armor. Mission parameters: survive, assess, adapt, swimming toward distant lights. A massive facility built on platforms rising from the ocean like a technological fortress. HUNK cataloged observations, different star patterns, unfamiliar storm characteristics. The platform's architecture suggested advanced civilization, but not any nation or corporation he recognized. New world, new variables, same objective: survive. He reached a maintenance platform beneath the main facility, climbing with practiced silence. His armor's systems were damaged, but functional. Communications offline. GPS error. Biometric scanners detecting atmospheric composition within human tolerance, but chemically distinct from Earth. The rational conclusion: he was no longer on his planet. Additional conclusion: the facility's security was focused outward, not inward. Sloppy. HUNK moved through maintenance corridors like a ghost, his red visor cutting through darkness, mapping the structure. The architecture was organic, grown rather than built. Alien, literally. He found observation windows overlooking vast cloning bays, thousands of transparent cylinders containing developing humanoid forms. Not human, taller, leaner, with elongated heads and large eyes. The facility was a cloning operation on an industrial scale HUNK had never witnessed. Even Umbrella's ambitions paled compared to this. Then he saw the scientists, also not human. Tall, graceful beings with pale skin and precise movements. They spoke a language his damaged translator couldn't interpret, but their body language was universal. Curiosity mixed with clinical detachment. They were examining something on a medical slab. One of the scientists turned, and HUNK saw its face. Elegant features, large dark eyes, an expression of intellectual focus. It gestured to others, and they approached the slab, where HUNK now realized another figure lay, a human in Mandalorian armor, dead, being dissected. The scientists were analyzing human physiology, taking samples, making notes on holographic displays that floated in the air like technological magic. This was a research facility, and humans were apparently rare enough here to warrant detailed study. HUNK recalculated his tactical position. He was injured in unknown territory, surrounded by an alien species conducting genetic research. The case in his possession contained bioweapon samples that had survived dimensional transit, samples that represented both massive threat and potential leverage. His armor's medical systems indicated internal injuries, damaged equipment, and depleted resources. Standard extraction protocols were impossible. Long-term survival required different approach. He waited until the scientists left their primary lab, then moved with perfect silence, entering the research area. The holographic displays were incomprehensible, but the laboratory equipment was recognizable. Gene sequencers, cloning apparatus, biological analysis systems. Advanced, but conceptually familiar. He placed his case on an examination table, opened it with biometric authorization, and withdrew a single T-virus variant sample. Then HUNK did something he'd never done before. He initiated contact. He remained in the room, visible, standing at parade rest with the sample held carefully in one hand. When the scientists returned and saw him, a human in tactical armor, alive and mobile, holding a vial that their sensors immediately identified as biological material, they didn't sound alarms. They approached with intellectual curiosity, speaking in their melodic language. HUNK pointed to the dead Mandalorian, then to himself, then to the vial. The message was clear. I am human. I possess biological materials. I am more valuable alive than dead. The lead scientist, taller than the others with subtle markings suggesting rank, studied HUNK with those large analytical eyes. It spoke into a communication device, and moments later, more scientists arrived. They surrounded HUNK, not threateningly, but with the focused intensity of researchers who just discovered an extraordinary specimen. One produced a scanning device, running it over HUNK's armored form. The device chirped, displaying data that made all the scientists pause. They spoke rapidly among themselves, excitement clear in their voices, despite the linguistic barrier. The scanner moved over the case, over the T-virus sample, and the reaction intensified. The lead scientist approached carefully, extending one long-fingered hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture. It pointed to HUNK, then to the cloning bays visible through the windows, then made a questioning motion. HUNK understood the implication. They were asking about his genetics, about whether he could be cloned like their other subjects. He'd survived Raccoon City, Rockford Island, and countless missions that killed entire Special Forces teams. He'd walked through environments saturated with bioweapons that turned humans into monsters. His body had adapted, evolved, become resistant to mutagens that dissolved normal human physiology. His genetics weren't just human, they were perfected through the cruelest evolutionary pressure imaginable, and these aliens wanted to study that perfection, perhaps replicate it. HUNK considered his options with the cold calculation that defined his existence. He was stranded in an alien galaxy with no extraction, no support, and injuries that would kill him without medical intervention. But he possessed something these researchers desperately wanted: the genetic template of the ultimate survivor, enhanced by bioweapon exposure into something beyond baseline human capabilities. In the case at his feet, leverage, bioweapons that could serve as either threat or bargaining chip. In his body, a commodity these aliens would value highly enough to keep him alive, perhaps even help him return home if their technology was sufficiently advanced. The Grim Reaper had faced worse odds and survived. This was simply another mission with adjusted parameters. HUNK reached up and removed his helmet, revealing his face for the first time. The scientists leaned forward, fascinated. He was human, but his eyes held something they'd never seen before: the absolute certainty of someone who'd stared at death and walked away every single time. He pointed to himself, then to the cloning bay, then extended his hand toward the lead scientist, offering the oldest transaction in human history: exchange. His genetics, his cooperation, his knowledge of bioweapons, in return for resources, medical care, and research into dimensional travel. The lead scientist's expression shifted into what might have been satisfaction. It took HUNK's hand, sealing an agreement that would change the galaxy forever. Neither of them knew it yet, but they just created the template for an army of 3 million soldiers, an army of clones who would inherit the Grim Reaper's genetics, his adaptive physiology, his survival instinct. And somewhere in the future, when HUNK woke from the stasis they would place him in, he would discover that millions of people now wore his face, carried his DNA, and were dying in a war they never chose to fight. The Grim Reaper always completed his missions, but this one was just beginning. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The Kaminoans called their world Kamino, and they were the galaxy's premier cloning specialists. For millennia, they'd perfected the science of genetic replication, creating custom-designed beings for clients across the stars. But they'd never encountered a specimen quite like the human who'd appeared in their facility during the storm season. Lama Su, Prime Minister of Kamino, stood in the observation chamber overlooking Medical Bay 7, watching a team of geneticists analyze their unexpected visitor. The human, he'd provided no name, responding only with silence to direct questions, lay motionless on the examination platform, allowing their scans with the patience of someone accustomed to medical procedures. His vital signs were extraordinary. His genetic markers were revolutionary. His cellular structure shows evidence of extensive mutagen exposure, Nalase reported, the chief medical scientist's tone carrying barely suppressed excitement. Yet, instead of degradation, we're observing adaptive evolution. His immune system has incorporated foreign genetic elements and repurposed them as enhancements: accelerated healing, enhanced metabolic efficiency, resistance to biological and chemical agents that would kill baseline humans. Natural selection under extreme conditions, Lama Su mused. Or deliberate engineering. Both, I believe. His muscle density is 40% higher than human standard, bone structure reinforced at the molecular level, neurological pathways optimized for rapid threat assessment and response. And this, Nalase manipulated the holographic display, highlighting a particular genetic sequence, is unlike anything in our databases, a self-repairing genetic code that actively corrects replication errors, near perfect stability across unlimited cloning cycles. Lama Su's large eyes narrowed with professional assessment. The Jango Fett template produces excellent soldiers, but this specimen, Jango Fett, is a skilled warrior with Mandalorian training, Nalase said carefully. This human is a survivor on a genetic level. His DNA doesn't just produce soldiers, it produces operatives who adapt, who refuse to die. Every cell in his body has been selected for one purpose: continued existence against impossible odds. The human on the examination table opened his eyes, cold, analytical, missing nothing, and stared directly at the observation window, despite it being one-way transparisteel. Somehow he knew they were watching. Somehow he knew exactly where to look. Lama Su felt something he rarely experienced: unease mixed with opportunity. As he communicated his requirements, he cannot speak our language, and we cannot speak his. But he's made his intentions clear through demonstration. Nalase brought up footage from the previous day. The human had opened his case, a container that their scans indicated was designed for biological sample transport, and carefully displayed several sealed vials containing organic materials. The footage showed him placing one vial in their analysis equipment, then stepping back and waiting with military patience while their systems processed the contents. When the results appeared, 3 geneticists had immediately evacuated the lab in terror. The sample contained a pathogen so virulent, so perfectly designed to hijack cellular reproduction, that even Kaminoan expertise couldn't fully comprehend its lethality. A bioweapon, Lama Su stated. A masterpiece of biological engineering, Nalase corrected. Whoever created this possessed genetic manipulation knowledge approaching our own. And he carries multiple variants in that case, all sealed, all stable, all under his control. A threat, or a demonstration of capability. He showed us what he possesses, then sealed it away again. He hasn't threatened us. He's established parameters for negotiation. Lama Su understood. The human couldn't speak their language, couldn't communicate through normal channels, so he'd communicated through universal concepts. I have value as a genetic template. I have power as a bioweapon carrier. I will cooperate if my terms are met. What terms? Nalase gestured to a holographic display showing crude but effective diagrams the human had drawn using their systems. He wants medical treatment for his injuries. He wants access to our research databases, specifically anything related to dimensional mechanics, spatial anomalies, or faster-than-light travel. And he wants... She paused, manipulating the display to show the final image. The human lying in a stasis pod with temporal calculations surrounding him. He wants to be placed in stasis while we conduct research, Lama Su said slowly. He's willing to provide his genetic material for our use, but he wants us to simultaneously work on finding a way to return him to his dimension of origin. Essentially, yes, he provides the template, we provide the research. An exchange of services. Lama Su considered this with the calculating mind of a businessman who'd built an empire on cloning contracts. The Republic had approached them about producing a clone army, a massive undertaking that would require an exceptional template. Jango Fett was their current candidate, skilled, experienced with proven combat genetics. But Jango demanded payment, demanded to raise a single unmodified clone, demanded respect. This human demanded only medical care, research assistance, and stasis. No ongoing payments, no complications. And his genetics were objectively superior for creating soldiers designed to survive unsurvivable situations. But there was a problem. If we use him as the template instead of Jango Fett, we lose Mandalorian combat training, Lama Su noted. Jango agreed to train the first generations of clones personally. We can hire Mandalorian trainers, Nala Se countered. Jango Fett isn't the only warrior in the galaxy, but this human's genetics can't be replicated. His adaptive evolution, his survival instinct coded into every cell. These aren't trained, they're inherent. Every clone would possess these advantages from birth. Lama Su made his decision with the certainty of someone who'd built a civilization on genetic science. Prepare the contracts. We'll use both templates initially, a small batch from each for comparison. Whichever produces superior results becomes the primary army template. The Republic wants soldiers. We'll give them the best soldiers possible. And the humans' research into dimensional travel. Assign a team. It serves our interests to explore such phenomena regardless. If we succeed in returning him to his dimension, we gain knowledge of trans-dimensional mechanics. If we fail, he remains in stasis indefinitely, and we've lost nothing. He may object to indefinite stasis. Lama Su's expression suggested this was not a primary concern. He'll be unconscious, and his genetic legacy will serve the Republic for generations. That's adequate compensation. 3 days later, HUNK stood in the cloning facility's deepest laboratory, watching Kaminoan scientists prepare the stasis pod that would hold him while they worked. They'd treated his injuries with medical technology decades beyond anything Umbrella possessed. They'd provided him access to their databases through translation software that allowed basic communication. And they'd shown him preliminary genetic analysis that confirmed his DNA would produce viable clones with his enhanced characteristics. The Kaminoans believed they were exploiting him, trading temporary services for his permanent contribution to their cloning program. They thought he didn't understand the scope of what they were proposing. HUNK understood perfectly. He simply didn't care. His priority was surviving until he could return home. If that meant allowing these aliens to clone his genetics, so be it. The clones wouldn't be him. They'd lack his experience, his training, his mission history. They'd be blank slates with his physical template, nothing more. The lead scientist, Nala Se, according to the translation software, approached with a datapad displaying contract terms in broken but comprehensible English. Medical treatment completed. Genetic sample collection authorized. Stasis duration until dimensional research yields results. Compensation none required beyond research assistance. HUNK read the terms with professional thoroughness. There was a clause about the clones being used for military purposes, another about the Kaminoans retaining full rights to the genetic material and all derived products. Essentially, they were purchasing his DNA outright. In another context, he might have negotiated harder, but negotiation required leverage beyond immediate survival, and HUNK's situation was clear. He was stranded in an alien galaxy with no extraction, no support, and no way home except through their technology. The contract was acceptable because he had no better alternatives. He signed using the stylus they provided. His signature, a simple series of letters. HUNK. No elaboration, no explanation. Nala Se examined the signature with curiosity. This designation, it's not a name. HUNK stared at her with the flat effect of someone who'd stopped being a person and become an operational asset years ago. Names were irrelevant. Mission completion was everything. Very well, Nala Se said, accepting his silence. The stasis pod is prepared. We estimate dimensional research will require approximately 3 to 5 years. You'll be unconscious throughout. When we wake you, we'll either have a method to return you home, or we'll have exhausted all viable research avenues. HUNK moved toward the pod without hesitation. It was a coffin made of technology lined with preservation systems that would keep his body in perfect suspended animation. To the Kaminoans, it was a temporary measure. To HUNK, it was tactically sound. Conserve resources, minimize risk, allow the specialists to work while he remained preserved. He climbed into the pod, settling into position with the ease of someone who'd slept in worse conditions. The bioweapon case remained sealed nearby, under Kaminoan security that he'd already assessed as inadequate. If he woke and needed the samples, he could retrieve them. If he didn't wake, well, that would resolve all concerns permanently. Nala C initiated the stasis sequence. Cold flooded the pod, lowering HUNK's body temperature, slowing his metabolism to near hibernation levels. His last conscious thought before the chemicals pulled him under was purely tactical: objective status pending, timeline unknown, survival probability acceptable. The Grim Reaper's eyes closed. His vitals dropped to minimal levels. The pod sealed with a hiss of pressurized gas, and in the laboratory surrounding him, Kaminoan scientists immediately began extracting genetic samples, processing his DNA, preparing the first batch of clone embryos that would grow into soldiers bearing his face, his genetics, his survival instinct. They worked with the efficiency of master craftsmen, unaware that they were creating something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just soldiers, not just clones, but 3 million copies of a man who'd never failed a mission, never accepted defeat, never stopped surviving no matter what hell he faced. The Republic wanted an army. The Kaminoans were building them a legion of Grim Reapers, and the original lay sleeping, dreaming of nothing, while his genetic legacy spread across the galaxy. Years passed. The Clone Wars began. Millions of soldiers wearing HUNK's face fought and died on 1,000 worlds. And through it all, the stasis pod remained sealed, its occupant unaware that he'd become the template for the largest army the galaxy had ever seen. Until the day the power fluctuated, the systems failed, and the pod began its emergency revival sequence. The Grim Reaper was waking up, and he was going to have questions. The first sensation was cold. Not the comfortable cold of stasis, but the sharp, biting cold of systems failing. HUNK's combat-trained consciousness surfaced immediately, bypassing the grogginess that would incapacitate normal humans emerging from long-term suspended animation. His eyes snapped open behind his visor, tactical assessment already running. Compromised stasis pod. Emergency revival protocol initiated. Unknown duration of suspension. Hostile environment probable. The pod's canopy retracted with a hiss of escaping gases. HUNK sat up, his enhanced physiology adapting to sudden oxygenation in seconds, while others would need minutes. His armor's systems flickered back online, running diagnostics, displaying errors across multiple subsystems. But the critical functions remained. Environmental seals, heads-up display, threat detection. The laboratory was in chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in red. Alarms blared in that same melodic Kaminoan language he'd heard before stasis. Through the transparasteel walls, he could see Kaminoan scientists evacuating, moving with urgent but orderly precision away from something. HUNK rolled out of the pod, landing in a combat crouch, scanning for immediate threats. His bioweapon case remained where he'd left it, locked, sealed, exactly where it should be. He grabbed it with magnetic seals, attaching it to his armor, then moved toward the nearest terminal. The holographic display activated at his touch, showing. He stopped, processed, recalculated every assumption he'd made. The date stamp on the system read 10 years after he'd entered stasis. 10 years. The Kaminoans had promised 3 to 5 years of research. Someone had lied or circumstances had changed. He accessed the facility's security feeds, his translator software, still functioning despite the decade gap, rendering Kaminoan text into broken English. What he saw made him pause for the second time. Clone troopers, thousands of them, all wearing white armor with colored markings denoting rank and unit, all moving through Kamino's corridors with military precision, all bearing his face beneath their helmets. HUNK pulled up archived footage, fast-forwarding through years of data. He watched the clone program expand from initial batches to full production, watched the first clones reach maturity in accelerated growth chambers, watched them receive military training from hired Mandalorian instructors, watched them deploy off-world to fight in something the database called the Clone Wars. The Republic, a massive democratic government spanning thousands of worlds, had commissioned the Kaminoans to produce a grand army, 3 million clone troopers, all created from a single genetic template. The database indicated that template was designated CT-00 in official records. HUNK pulled up the genetic profile for CT-00. His DNA, his cellular structure, his adaptive mutations from bioweapon exposure. They'd cloned him 3 million times and sent those clones to fight a galactic war. The Kaminoans had used him more extensively than agreed. The contract had mentioned military purposes, but HUNK had assumed a small force, hundreds, perhaps thousands, not millions, not an army that spanned the entire galaxy. Tactical reassessment. The situation was significantly more complex than anticipated. He accessed more files, learning rapidly. The Clone Wars had begun 3 years ago when the Republic discovered the clone army on Kamino, an army secretly commissioned by a now-dead Jedi Master. The clones had been deployed immediately to fight the Separatist Alliance, a faction of systems that had broken away from Republic control. The war was galactic in scale, with battles on thousands of worlds simultaneously, and every clone trooper bore HUNK's genetics. They called themselves brothers. They fought with coordinated precision that military analysts attributed to their identical genetics and shared training. They died in massive numbers. Casualty reports showed hundreds of thousands already lost. HUNK watched footage of clone battalions executing complex maneuvers under fire, saw them adapt to hostile environments, observed their survival rates in situations that should have produced total casualties. His genetics gave them advantages: faster healing, better stress adaptation, enhanced pattern recognition under pressure, but it also made them expendable in the eyes of their commanders, because there were always more clones, always more soldiers wearing his face. The alarms continued blaring. HUNK pulled up current facility status. Separatist attack in progress. Droid forces had infiltrated Kamino's lower levels. Clone defenders were holding them off, but the situation was deteriorating. The Kaminoans were evacuating to secured zones while clone troopers fought and died to buy them time. HUNK accessed external feeds, watching the battle unfold. Aquatic assault vehicles breaching Kamino's ocean platforms, battle droids swarming through corridors, clone troopers, his clones, meeting them with disciplined fire and tactical movement. One feed showed a clone commander directing his squad through a flanking maneuver that cut off a droid advance. The tactic was efficient, economical, exactly what HUNK would have done in the same situation. The clone executed it flawlessly, then was hit by blaster fire from an unexpected angle. He went down. His squad dragged him to cover, tried to stabilize him. He died anyway. Another clone took command without hesitation, continued the mission, completed the objective. The efficiency was remarkable. The casualty acceptance was appalling. HUNK watched 3 more clones die in the next 2 minutes of footage. Each time, the survivors adapted, continued, completed their objectives. They fought like professionals because his genetics had given them the foundation. But they died like amateurs because nobody had taught them what HUNK had learned through dozens of missions. Completion means nothing if you don't survive to report it. The Umbrella Corporation had been evil, exploitative, willing to sacrifice operatives for profit. But even Umbrella understood that elite operatives were valuable assets worth recovering. The Special Forces teams HUNK had watched die in Raccoon City. Those deaths had happened because of bioweapon outbreaks, not because commanders had deliberately sent them into meat grinders. These clones were being used as disposable tools, sent into frontal assaults that better tactics could avoid. Deployed in suicide missions because there were always more clones in the production tubes. HUNK felt something he rarely experienced: anger. Not the hot rage of impulsive violence, but the cold fury of professional offense. These were his genetics, his adaptive physiology, his survival instinct coded into every cell, and they were being wasted. He moved through the facility with ghost-like silence, following the sounds of combat. The red emergency lighting gave everything a hellish cast as he navigated corridors filled with blast marks and spent plasma cartridges. He passed fallen clones, bodies in white armor, identical faces slack in death beneath shattered helmets. Each corpse bore his features, his bone structure, his genetic legacy frozen in the moment of termination. HUNK reached a defensive position where a squad of clones was holding a junction against advancing battle droids. The clones had established overlapping fields of fire, but they were positioned too far forward, leaving their flanks exposed. Standard Republic tactical doctrine, probably. Aggressive, direct, effective against most enemies, but vulnerable to adaptive response. The droids were adapting. 3 units had detached from the main assault, moving through side corridors to flank the clone position. The clones hadn't noticed yet because they were focused on the frontal assault. HUNK calculated engagement parameters in milliseconds. The flanking droids would reach firing positions in 30 seconds. The clones would be caught in crossfire. Standard response would be to break and retreat, which would collapse this defensive line and allow droids to penetrate deeper into the facility. Unacceptable. HUNK didn't leave his people exposed when better options existed. He moved with the predatory efficiency that had earned him his nickname, circling through adjacent corridors to intercept the flanking droids. His weapons were 10 years out of date by this galaxy's standards, but bullets still destroyed mechanical targets effectively. He dropped the first droid with a 3-round burst to its central processing unit. The second turned to engage and received a breaching charge to its chassis, the explosive detonating with precisely calculated force to disable without alerting the main droid force. The third droid got off a shot that sparked against HUNK's armor before he closed distance and drove his combat knife through its optical sensor into whatever passed for its brain. All 3 droids neutralized in under 6 seconds. Silent, professional. invisible to the main battle. HUNK returned to observe the clone squad. They'd held their position, unaware they'd been 30 seconds from catastrophic flank collapse. Their commander, designated by orange markings on his armor, was directing fire with competent precision, but the tactics were still too aggressive, burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. HUNK watched for another minute, cataloging deficiencies. The clones had his genetics but lacked his experience. They fought bravely but inefficiently. They showed courage but made mistakes that training should have corrected. The Grim Reaper had survived every mission because he'd learned to balance aggression with conservation, speed with patience, violence with precision. These clones had the foundation. His genetics gave them the capacity, but nobody had taught them how to apply it. The clone commander's helmet turned slightly, scanning the corridor. For a moment, HUNK thought he'd been spotted despite his stealth position. But the clone was simply maintaining situational awareness, checking flanks that had just been secured without his knowledge. Good instinct. HUNK's genetics providing survival awareness, even without experience to interpret it properly. The battle continued. The clones held. The droids eventually withdrew, their assault failing to breach the defensive perimeter. The clone squad began casualty assessment. 2 wounded, none killed. Acceptable losses for a defensive engagement. HUNK melted back into the shadows before they could detect his presence. He needed more information before revealing himself. Needed to understand the full scope of what the Kaminoans had created, what the Republic had done with his genetics, what role these clones played in the larger conflict. He accessed a secure terminal using Umbrella Corporation infiltration protocols that worked surprisingly well on Kaminoan security systems. The data he found was extensive: deployment records, casualty reports, tactical assessments, command structure documentation. The clones were designated CT for Clone Trooper, followed by numerical identifiers. They were organized into legions, battalions, companies, squads. They were commanded by Jedi, Force-sensitive mystics who served as generals in this Republic military despite having no formal military training. The clones themselves were regarded as equipment, not citizens. They had no rights, no freedom, no existence beyond service to the Republic, and they were dying by the thousands, not just in combat, but in preventable situations where better tactics, better equipment, or better strategic planning would have saved them. The casualty reports read like a horror catalog of military incompetence enabled by disposable soldiers. HUNK pulled up footage of a battle on a planet called Geonosis. He watched clones deployed via dropship into kill zones, sent forward without adequate reconnaissance, committed to frontal assaults against fortified positions. They'd won the battle through sheer numbers and bravery. The casualty rate had been 40%. 40% losses was a catastrophic failure by any professional military standard. In special forces operations, losing more than 10% of your team meant the mission planning was fundamentally flawed. These clones were being led by commanders who treated them as unlimited resources. The Grim Reaper had never lost a team member on missions he'd personally planned. Not because he was lucky, but because he'd calculated every variable, prepared for every contingency, and adapted when situations changed. These clones had his genetics, his capacity for tactical thinking, his survival instinct, but they were being led by Jedi who relied on mystical force powers instead of proper military doctrine. HUNK made a decision with the same cold rationality that defined his existence. His original mission, return home through dimensional research, remained the priority. But he was stranded in this galaxy for the foreseeable future, and 3 million clones bearing his genetics were being wasted through incompetent leadership. That was unacceptable, not because of sentiment or attachment, but because it was inefficient, wasteful, professionally offensive. The Grim Reaper didn't waste assets, and these clones were technically his assets, his genetic legacy, his responsibility by the simple fact that they existed because of him. He would observe, assess, analyze, and if the situation warranted intervention, he would intervene. Not to save the galaxy, not to win their war, but to ensure that soldiers bearing his DNA weren't being thrown away like defective equipment. Professional standards had to mean something, even in an alien galaxy at war. HUNK disappeared into Kamino's infrastructure, a ghost in the machine, watching the clone army prepare for deployment. The separatist attack had been repelled. The facility was secure, but out in the galaxy the Clone Wars raged on, and the Grim Reaper was awake, aware, and thoroughly displeased with how his clones were being utilized. That was going to change. The Republic cruiser Resolute hung in orbit above Christophsis, its hangar bay organized chaos as clone troopers prepared for the next planetary assault. General Anakin Skywalker stood on the command deck, reviewing holographic battle plans with Captain Rex, his clone commander who'd proven himself exceptional, even among the already impressive clone officer corps. The Separatists have fortified the city center, Rex reported, his voice carrying the efficiency that came from accelerated training and natural tactical aptitude. Direct assault will result in heavy casualties, but if we can flank through the eastern sector, we'll be exposed to their artillery positions, Anakin finished, seeing the tactical problem immediately. And the buildings are too densely packed for effective air support. Yes, sir. It's going to be a tough fight. Anakin studied the hologram, searching for an opening that didn't involve sending his men into a meat grinder. The clone troopers were incredible soldiers, brave, disciplined, adaptive, but they weren't invincible. He'd already lost too many good men in this war, watched too many identical faces go still beneath shattered helmets. General Skywalker, one of the bridge officers, called out, "We're receiving reports of unusual activity in the lower decks. Security found evidence of unauthorized access to restricted areas." Separatist infiltrators? Rex's hand moved to his blaster immediately. Unknown. No alarms were triggered, but someone accessed ammunition storage, medical supplies, and the tactical database. All accesses were covered by what appeared to be legitimate security codes. Anakin exchanged glances with Rex. Lock down the ship. Find whoever it is. In the Resolute's ventilation system, HUNK listened to the conversation through the ship's internal communications network he'd spliced into hours earlier. The security response was predictable, thorough but focused on external threats. They were looking for separatist saboteurs using standard infiltration protocols. They wouldn't find him. HUNK had been evading security systems since before most of these clones had been decanted from their growth chambers. The Republic's military security was adequate for conventional threats. He was not a conventional threat. He'd spent the past 48 hours infiltrating this cruiser after stowing away on a supply transport from Kamino. His objectives were reconnaissance and assessment, observe clone operations in combat conditions, evaluate tactical doctrine, determine whether the systemic inefficiencies he'd identified in casualty reports were command failures or unavoidable circumstances. What he'd found was worse than the report suggested. The Republic military command structure was a disaster. Jedi generals with no military training, making strategic decisions based on intuition and Force guidance rather than tactical analysis. Clone officers like Rex were competent, but they were implementing flawed strategies handed down by commanders who'd never studied logistics, combined arms doctrine, or operational security. HUNK had watched Rex plan the Christophsis assault. The clone's tactical thinking was sound. He'd identified the same problems Anakin had, calculated similar risk assessments, proposed reasonable alternatives. But the final decision rested with the Jedi, and Jedi made decisions based on instinct, not methodology. It was like watching Umbrella executives make tactical calls. People with authority, but no expertise, sending operatives into situations they didn't understand, surprised when casualties exceeded projections. The difference was that Umbrella's incompetence had gotten dozens killed. The Republic's incompetence was killing thousands. HUNK moved through the ventilation system with practiced silence, navigating toward the hangar bay, where clone battalions were assembling for planetary deployment. He needed to see them in action, watch how they fought under pressure, determine if intervention was warranted or if they were simply doomed by systemic failures he couldn't correct. He dropped from a maintenance shaft into a shadowed corner of the hangar, landing without sound despite the 12-foot fall. His armor's systems had adapted to Republic technology. He'd upgraded power cells, integrated their communications protocols, modified his weapons to accept their ammunition. After 10 years of stasis, his equipment had been obsolete. Now it was hybridized, combining Umbrella Corporation engineering with Republic military technology. The result was a silent predator wearing armor that didn't register on their sensors, carrying weapons that wouldn't show up in their security sweeps, operating with tactics they had no framework to detect or counter. HUNK observed the clone battalions assembling for drop. They moved with military precision, checking equipment, loading into LAT gunships, preparing for the assault that would send them into Christophsis's urban warfare hell. They joked with each other, personality quirks emerging despite identical genetics, showing that nature and nurture both shaped these soldiers. One clone was checking his rifle's power cell 3 times, a nervous tick that suggested this was his first combat drop. Another was completely calm, veteran by bearing if not by age. A third was encouraging the nervous one, offering reassurance that rang with genuine care despite military professionalism. They were individuals, not copies of HUNK, but people who happened to share his genetics. They developed personalities, relationships, individual identities within the framework of military service. And they were about to be deployed in an assault that HUNK's analysis suggested would result in approximately 30% casualties. He watched them board the gunships, watched the pilots run pre-flight checks, watched the Jedi generals, Anakin Skywalker and another Jedi, take positions in the command gunship. The assault force lifted off, repulsor engines thrumming as they headed toward the planet below. HUNK made a calculated decision. He moved to the last gunship in the formation, a support vessel carrying medical supplies and backup troops, and slipped aboard during the final boarding sequence. The clones were focused on their equipment, their conversations, their pre-battle rituals. None of them noticed the shadow that settled into the cargo compartment among the medical crates. The gunship dropped from the cruiser, joining the formation descending toward Christophsis. Through the troop compartment's open doors, HUNK could see the planet's crystalline architecture rising from desert sands, beautiful and utterly unsuitable for urban warfare. The crystals would create unpredictable ricochet patterns, limit visibility, provide infinite ambush positions. The tactical situation was worse than the holographic briefing had suggested. This was going to be a bloodbath. The assault began with predictable disaster. The LA-AT gunships descended into the city, and separatist anti-aircraft fire erupted from fortified positions the reconnaissance had somehow missed. 2 gunships exploded immediately, their clone complements vaporized before they could deploy. Another 3 took critical damage, crashing into crystalline buildings and fireballs of twisted metal and screaming soldiers. Anakin's gunship survived, deploying its troops under heavy fire. Captain Rex hit the ground running, directing his men into cover, establishing firing positions with the competence HUNK had observed in the planning stages. But the tactical situation was already compromised. They'd landed in a kill zone surrounded by elevated positions that separatist battle droids were exploiting with mechanical precision. HUNK's gunship landed in a secondary zone, deploying its troops and medical supplies before lifting off to provide air support. The clones moved toward the sounds of combat, following their training, advancing to reinforce the primary assault force. HUNK moved with them, invisible in the chaos, analyzing the battlefield with professional detachment. The clone tactics were sound within the parameters of their training, but those parameters were flawed. They were advancing too aggressively, exposing themselves to crossfire, prioritizing forward momentum over survival. A clone squad rounded a corner and walked directly into a prepared ambush. Battle droids in elevated positions, overlapping fields of fire, kill zone established. The standard Republic tactical response would be to advance under fire, overwhelm through aggression and superior marksmanship. HUNK watched the squad leader prepare to give that order, watched the clones ready themselves for the suicidal advance, watched death approach with mathematical certainty. Professional standards had to mean something. HUNK moved faster than human reaction time should allow. His bio-enhanced physiology operating at the peak efficiency that had survived Raccoon City's nightmare. He emerged from cover, threw a breaching charge with perfect accuracy, and was back in concealment before the clones even registered his presence. The charge detonated against the crystal wall behind the battle droids. The crystalline structure, already stressed by blaster fire, shattered in a cascade of razor-sharp fragments that shredded the droids like mechanical confetti. The ambush collapsed in seconds, leaving the clone squad staring at destroyed enemies they hadn't even fired at. "What the?" one clone started. "Defensive positions," their sergeant barked, demonstrating good instinct even in confusion. "Someone's helping us, but we don't know who. Stay sharp." HUNK was already gone, moving to the next crisis point. A clone heavy weapons team was pinned down by a separatist tank, an AAT hovering on repulsor fields, its main cannon tracking toward their position. Standard doctrine said call for air support, but the gunships were engaged elsewhere. The clones were going to die in approximately 15 seconds. HUNK's weapons were insufficient to penetrate the tank's armor, but he didn't need to penetrate armor. He needed to exploit design flaws. The AAT's repulsor systems vented heat through underslung panels, a necessary engineering compromise that created a critical vulnerability. He fired a sustained burst into the vent panel from an elevated position, his armor's targeting systems calculating the exact angle needed. Superheated plasma from the blaster bolts entered the repulsor chamber, caused a cascading thermal overload, and the tank dropped like a stone, crashing into the ground hard enough to crack its hull. The crew bailed out directly into the clone heavy weapons team's sights. The clones didn't question their sudden good fortune. They engaged the fleeing droids, secured the position, and continued their advance. Professional soldiers adapting to changing circumstances, HUNK moved through the battlefield like a ghost, intervening at critical junctures, collapsing ambushes before they could spring, eliminating threats the clones hadn't detected. He operated by instinct developed through decades of missions, seeing patterns that even experienced clone commanders missed. A sniper droid in a crystal tower, eliminated with a long-range shot before it could target clone officers. A separatist flanking maneuver moving through underground tunnels, collapsed with precisely placed explosives that sealed the tunnels and trapped the droids. A clone medic attempting to reach wounded soldiers in a fire zone, suppressing fire from an impossible angle that allowed the medic to complete his rescue. Each intervention was invisible, professional, leaving no evidence of his presence. The clones attributed their sudden tactical advantages to luck, to the Force, to battlefield chaos working in their favor. None of them suspected that someone was systematically ensuring their survival. In the command position, Anakin felt it through the Force, subtle shifts in the battle's flow, probabilities changing in ways that didn't match his precognitive sense. Something was helping them, but he couldn't identify what. The Force showed him shadows where clarity should exist, blind spots in his awareness. "Rex, are you seeing this?" Anakin asked over comms. "The Separatists keep making tactical errors. It's like they're being outmaneuvered by someone we can't see." "I noticed, General," Rex replied, his tone cautious. "Ambushes failing before we reach them. Support positions eliminated before we knew they existed. Either we're getting extremely lucky, or someone's running counter-operations against the Separatists." "But who? Our only forces are accounted for." "Unknown, sir. But whoever it is, they're keeping my men alive. I'm not questioning that." The battle continued. The clone casualties that should have been catastrophic remained manageable. The assault that should have failed succeeded, and through it all, HUNK operated in the spaces between awareness, correcting the tactical incompetence of Jedi generals through silent, ruthless efficiency. By the time Christophsis was secured, clone casualties were at 8% instead of the projected 30%. Anakin called it a victory guided by the Force. Rex called it the most unusual battle he'd ever fought. The clones called it luck and moved on to the next war zone. None of them knew that the Grim Reaper had decided their survival was a professional standard worth maintaining. And HUNK, watching from shadows as the clones celebrated their victory, calculated his next moves. He'd confirmed the problem. Now he needed to implement the solution. These were his clones, his genetics, his responsibility, and the Grim Reaper always completed his missions. Even if this mission was keeping 3 million copies of himself alive in a war they didn't choose to fight. The medical bay on the Resolute was empty at 0300 hours, exactly as HUNK had calculated. Clone troopers operated on strict duty rotations, medical staff included. This time slot fell between shifts, leaving a 90-second window of complete privacy. More than enough time for someone with his training. Captain Rex lay on the surgical table, fully conscious despite the local anesthetic numbing his skull. HUNK had insisted on awareness during the procedure, not cruelty but tactical necessity. If something went wrong, Rex needed the ability to report symptoms immediately rather than dying unconscious from a surgical error. "This is insane," Rex muttered, staring at the ceiling while HUNK prepared micro-surgical instruments that looked disturbingly improvised. "Letting someone operate on my brain in a maintenance bay, with equipment you built from spare parts. Medical bay, HUNK corrected, his hands steady as he calibrated the neural scanner. And the equipment is adequate. I've performed field surgery in worse conditions. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate. HUNK brought the scanner online, displaying Rex's neural architecture in holographic detail. There, buried in the brain tissue near the prefrontal cortex, was the biochip, a tiny piece of technology smaller than a grain of sand, connected to neural pathways with microscopic filaments that would trigger programmed behaviors when activated. Order 66. Execute the Jedi. Turn loyal soldiers into assassins with a single transmitted code. HUNK had seen similar technology in Umbrella Corporation labs, behavioral modification chips designed to control bioweapon test subjects. The Kaminoans' version was more sophisticated, better integrated, but the principle was identical. Override free will with programmed commands. He'd removed 2 chips already, one from Commander Cody, another from a clone medic named Kix, who'd discovered the conspiracy independently and been scheduled for memory wipe. Both procedures had been successful. Both clones had woken up changed, reporting a clarity they couldn't quite articulate, like static clearing from a frequency they hadn't known was corrupted. Beginning extraction, HUNK said, activating the micro-manipulator. The device extended a filament-thin probe through the entry point he'd created, a precision opening in Rex's skull that would heal without scarring if done correctly. Don't move, don't talk, breathe normally. Rex went rigid as the probe entered his brain tissue. The anesthetic prevented pain, but the sensation of foreign objects moving through neural matter was disturbing on a primal level. HUNK worked with the mechanical precision of someone who'd operated on himself multiple times, extracting bullets, removing shrapnel, performing field surgery that should have required full medical teams. The probe located the chip's connection points. HUNK deployed micro-cutters that severed the filaments one by one, isolating the chip from Rex's neural pathways. The process took 11 minutes of absolute concentration. Any mistake could cause permanent brain damage, vegetative state, or death. Finally, the chip was free. HUNK extracted it with the same care a bomb technician would use diffusing explosives. The tiny device came out coated in Rex's blood, innocuous and terrible in its simplicity. Done, HUNK said, sealing the incision with medical adhesive that would dissolve as the tissue healed. Sit up slowly. Report any dizziness, vision problems, or cognitive disruption. Rex sat up carefully, his hand moving to the small bandage on his head. I feel clear, like I've been wearing a helmet that was too tight and someone finally adjusted it. That's normal. The chip created low-level neural interference that you adapted to. Removing it feels like relief. HUNK placed the extracted chip in a sealed container. You're the 3rd clone commander to undergo this procedure. I recommend you don't disclose this to anyone outside your trusted circle. If whoever commissioned these chips learns they're being removed, they'll accelerate their timeline. You think someone's planning to activate Order 66 soon? I think someone invested significant resources in creating a sleeper army. That's not an investment made without intent to use it. HUNK cleaned the surgical instruments with methodical efficiency. The war is being manipulated. The Republic and Separatists both serve larger agendas. When those agendas converge, 3 million clone troopers will receive the order to kill every Jedi in the galaxy simultaneously. Rex processed this with the tactical mind that HUNK's genetics had given him. And you're removing chips one at a time. That's not scalable. Even if you operated non-stop, you couldn't remove 3 million chips before Order 66 activates. Correct, which is why I'm only removing chips from commanders and key personnel. Create a network of clones who can make independent decisions. When Order 66 transmits, most clones will comply. But the commanders, those with removed chips, can choose to refuse, can protect Jedi who've earned their loyalty, can make tactical decisions that aren't programmed. You're creating a resistance cell inside the clone army. I'm creating flexibility in a system designed for rigid control. When the activation occurs, the galaxy will need soldiers who can think independently rather than follow programming. HUNK sealed the medical waste, erasing evidence of the procedure. That's strategic planning, not rebellion. Rex slid off the table, testing his balance. The clarity he felt wasn't imaginary. It was like seeing colors he hadn't known existed, thinking thoughts that had previously felt suppressed. The Jedi are going to die, aren't they? When Order 66 activates, most clones will execute them without hesitation. Probability 93%, HUNK confirmed. The chips override ethical considerations, emotional bonds, and tactical analysis. The clones will kill the Jedi because they're programmed to kill the Jedi. Only those with removed chips will have the ability to question the order. Then we need to remove more chips. Commander Wolf, Commander Bly, every ARC trooper, No. HUNK's tone carried finality. Accelerated removal attracts attention. We move slowly, carefully, target high-value personnel who can maximize impact when Order 66 activates, commanders who lead battalions, medical personnel who can continue removals independently, intelligence officers who can identify Jedi worth protecting. Rex wanted to argue, wanted to save every brother he could, but the tactical logic was sound. Trying to save everyone would alert their enemies and save no one. How many have you removed so far? 17. 14 commanders, 2 medics, 1 intelligence analyst, each sworn to secrecy, each given modified doctrine that prioritizes clone survival over mission completion, each positioned to make critical decisions when the activation occurs. And after Order 66, after the Jedi are dead and the Republic becomes whatever it's becoming, what then? HUNK was silent for a moment, which was answer enough. Survival. The clones with removed chips will be free agents in a galaxy that no longer wants them. They'll need to adapt, find purpose beyond military service, or die as obsolete equipment. You make it sound so optimistic. I make it sound realistic. Your soldiers created for a specific war. When that war ends, your purpose ends, unless you create new purpose. HUNK moved toward the door. The choice is yours. Follow programming and become assassins. Remove chips and become soldiers who choose their battles. Or do nothing and hope someone else solves problems you're uniquely positioned to address. Rex caught HUNK's arm before he could leave, a gesture that would have been suicidal with anyone else. Why? You keep saying we're assets, that this is professional standards, but you're risking everything to remove chips from clones you don't know, to save Jedi you have no connection to. Why? HUNK looked at Rex's hand on his arm, then at Rex's face, a face that was his own, copied and modified by Kaminoan science into 3 million variations. Because, he said finally, I've worked for organizations that treated operatives as expendable. I've watched good soldiers die because commanders viewed them as replaceable, and I've survived every mission because I refused to accept that assessment. He removed Rex's hand with care rather than violence. "You're derived from my genetics. That makes you my responsibility, and I don't leave my people to die when better options exist." HUNK left before Rex could respond, disappearing into the ship's corridors with the silence that had earned him the Ghost Trooper legend. Rex stood alone in the medical bay, one hand touching the bandage where a chip that could have turned him into a murderer had been removed. Around the galaxy, 16 other clones stood in similar positions, feeling the same clarity, making the same calculations. The Grim Reaper was building an army within an army, not to overthrow the Republic, but to survive its inevitable collapse. And every clone commander who received chip removal became a node in a network that could choose when to follow orders and when to preserve something more important: the ability to make their own decisions. 3 weeks later, on the separatist-held world of Anaxes, the Ghost Trooper legend reached new heights. An entire clone battalion, the 327th under Commander Bly, had been trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded by overwhelming droid forces with no viable extraction route. Republic Command had written them off as acceptable losses. Jedi General Ila Sakura was preparing a hopeless rescue mission that would likely kill her and any clones who attempted it. Then the Separatist siege positions simply collapsed. Tactical droids reported system-wide failures across their command network, communication disruptions, automated defenses turning on their own forces, supply depots exploding in precisely calculated sequences that created a corridor through the siege. The 327th walked out through that corridor, every clone alive, while Separatist forces tore themselves apart through compromised systems they couldn't debug fast enough. Bly reported it as enemy technical failure. Ayla sensed disturbances in the force she couldn't identify. Republic intelligence classified it as unexplained tactical advantage. But the clones knew better. The clones had heard the rumors, seen the evidence, felt the presence of someone operating beyond their sensors' ability to detect. The Ghost Trooper had struck again, and the message was clear. Clones under his protection didn't die in suicide missions, written off as acceptable losses. In the depths of the Anaxes facility, HUNK erased his presence from Separatist computer systems, collected intelligence on Separatist strategic planning, and moved toward his next objective. He'd confirmed something during the infiltration. The war was being orchestrated from both sides by the same controlling intelligence. The Republic and Separatists were puppets fighting a scripted conflict, which meant Order 66 was approaching faster than his projections suggested. He needed to accelerate chip removals, needed to position more clones for independent action, needed to identify Jedi who could survive the coming purge and might serve as allies in whatever followed. But most importantly, he needed to continue doing what he'd always done, completing missions and keeping his people alive. Even if his people now numbered 3 million clones who shared his genetics, but had become something more than copies. They'd become soldiers he was training to survive, operatives he was teaching to think independently, assets he was preparing for a war that would make the Clone Wars look like a training exercise. The Grim Reaper had entered this galaxy by accident, stranded in an alien conflict he had no stake in. Now he was creating a force that could survive the apocalypse he knew was coming, one removed chip at a time, one saved battalion at a time, one tactical intervention at a time, because professional standards had to mean something, even in a galaxy far, far away from everything he'd known, fighting a war that wasn't his own. protecting soldiers who were copies of a man who'd stopped being human long before the cloning began. The mission parameters had changed. The objectives had evolved. But the core principle remained absolute. Complete the mission. Survive. Ensure your people survive. Everything else was secondary. The Kaminoan cloning facility stood pristine and sterile beneath Tapoka City's eternal storms, but its deepest laboratories, the ones not included in Republic tours, held secrets that even the Jedi Council had never seen. HUNK moved through those laboratories like a surgical instrument, through diseased tissue, methodical and precise, eliminating threats before they could metastasize. He'd returned to Kamino for one purpose: destroy the evidence of what the Kaminoans had truly created. Not just an army of clone troopers, but a biological weapons program built on his genetics, his resistance to mutagens, his adaptive physiology that had survived T-virus exposure, and worse. The laboratories were empty at this hour. Kaminoan scientists operated on rigid schedules that HUNK had mapped during his previous infiltration. Security was sophisticated but predictable. They'd designed systems to prevent external intrusion, not to stop someone who'd already been inside, who'd already mapped their networks, who'd already identified every weakness in their defensive architecture. HUNK accessed the primary research terminal, bypassing encryption that would have stopped Republic intelligence for months. What he found confirmed his worst projections. Project Apex genetic modification, using CT00 template to create enhanced bioweapons. Subjects would possess clone trooper combat training combined with viral adaptability, regenerative capabilities, and resistance to conventional countermeasures. Estimated combat effectiveness, 300% above baseline clone specifications. The Kaminoans had taken his genetics, already enhanced through bioweapon exposure, and weaponized them further. They were creating super soldiers using his DNA as the foundation, combining his natural advantages with their genetic engineering expertise. The project was in advanced development. 50 prototype subjects in growth acceleration chambers, projected maturity in 6 months, intended deployment, classified black operations requiring expendable assets with maximum survivability. HUNK studied the prototype specifications with professional detachment. The enhanced clones would be superior soldiers, stronger, faster, more resilient than standard clone troopers. They would also be monsters designed for missions that regular clones couldn't survive and that the Republic couldn't officially authorize. Umbrella Corporation had created similar assets. HUNK had killed most of them when their programming failed, and they became uncontrolled bioweapons. He recognized the same trajectory here, useful until they weren't, then catastrophic when control systems inevitably broke down. He set demolition charges at precisely calculated positions throughout the laboratory, shaped charges that would destroy biological samples, incinerate research data, and collapse the facility's structural supports. The Kaminoans would lose years of research and millions of credits in experimental subjects. They would also lose any leverage they had over him and his genetics. While the charges armed, HUNK accessed subsidiary files, searching for the ultimate answer to the question that had driven this infiltration. Who commissioned the behavioral modification chips? The answer was buried in classified contracts, hidden behind layers of authorization that required Kaminoan Prime Minister-level clearance. HUNK had that clearance now. He'd extracted it from Lamasu's private terminal during the Separatist attack 3 months ago, stored it for exactly this purpose. The contract signature made him pause. Not surprised, he'd suspected the truth, but confirmed. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, the Republic's elected leader, had personally commissioned the behavioral modification chips integrated into every clone trooper, the same Chancellor who'd somehow known about the clone army before anyone else. The same Chancellor who'd granted himself emergency powers that were never rescinded. The same Chancellor who was orchestrating both sides of the Clone Wars. HUNK downloaded the files, encrypted them, and transmitted them to the 17 clone commanders who'd received chip removals. They needed to understand what they were facing. Not just a war between Republic and Separatists, but a conspiracy that used clone troopers as disposable weapons in someone's larger game. The demolition charges reached final countdown. HUNK moved toward extraction, but footsteps in the corridor made him pause. Multiple figures approaching. Kaminoan gate pattern, security escort. They detected his intrusion faster than projected. HUNK calculated engagement parameters in milliseconds. 6 Kaminoan security personnel armed with stun weapons and one figure in the center who moved with different bearing, familiar bearing. He recognized the armor before he saw the face. Jango Fett, the Mandalorian bounty hunter who was supposed to be the clone army's template, who'd been replaced by HUNK's superior genetics, who'd taken a contract to train the first clone generations and had remained on Kamino ever since. The facility's original specimen, Jango said, his voice carrying Conquered Dawn accent through his helmet speakers. The Kaminoans thought you'd return eventually. They just didn't expect you to wait 3 months. HUNK assessed the tactical situation. Jango Fett was renowned as one of the galaxy's deadliest warriors, skilled enough that the Kaminoans had originally considered him perfect template material. The security detail was competent but secondary threat. The primary concern was the demolition charges countdown, 90 seconds until detonation. "You should evacuate," HUNK said, his first words to another human in this galaxy who wasn't a clone. "This facility is about to experience structural failure." Jango's helmet tilted slightly. Sabotage, I should have guessed. What did they do that was worth destroying millions of credits in research? They created weapons using stolen genetic material. I'm reclaiming ownership. HUNK's hand moved toward his sidearm, not threatening, just ready. "Leave now or die in the collapse. Your choice." "The clones," Jango said, ignoring the threat. "You've been intervening in their battles, saving them. The Ghost Trooper legend, that's you." Tactical doctrine correction. The Jedi waste clone lives through incompetence. I'm implementing efficiency standards. "Those clones should have been mine," Jango said, and HUNK heard genuine bitterness in his voice. "I negotiated the contract. I provided DNA samples. Then the Kaminoans found you and decided your genetics were superior. Do you know what it's like to be replaced? To watch millions of soldiers who should bear your face instead wear someone else's?" "No," HUNK said honestly. "I know what it's like to wake up and discover millions of soldiers wear my face without my consent. Different problem." 60 seconds until detonation. The Kaminoan security detail was retreating. They'd received evacuation warnings through internal comms. Jango remained, his stance suggesting he was considering options that included violence. "The Kaminoans will rebuild," Jango said. "They'll create new research from archived samples. You can't destroy knowledge permanently." "I can destroy their current progress and eliminate 50 prototype bioweapons they were creating using my genetics. HUNK moved toward the exit, not turning his back on Django, but not engaging either. The Republic doesn't need super soldiers designed for black operations. They especially don't need super soldiers built from DNA that's been exposed to bioweapon mutagens. "What are you?" Django asked, genuine curiosity overriding hostility. "The Kaminoans' reports say you survived exposure to pathogens that should have killed you, that you adapted instead of dying, that you're not just human anymore. You're something that evolved past human limitations." "I'm a survivor," HUNK replied. "Everything else is consequence." 40 seconds. Alarms began blaring as Kaminoan systems detected the demolition charges. Automated defenses activated, blast doors sealing, suppression systems engaging. But HUNK had anticipated these responses, had programmed the charges to detonate even under suppression, had calculated escape routes that would remain viable until the last possible moment. Django made his decision. "The clones you're protecting, they're good soldiers. Better than I expected, considering they didn't get my training methodology. Whatever you're teaching them, it's working. Casualty rates have dropped across every battalion where the Ghost Trooper's been sighted." "Professional standards," HUNK said. "I don't waste assets." "Assets?" Django's tone suggested he understood something HUNK hadn't articulated. "That's what they are to you. Not sons, not copies, not even soldiers. Just assets to be preserved because you don't accept losses." "Correct assessment." "Then maybe the Kaminoans made the right choice after all." "I would have been a father to those clones. Distant, maybe. Harsh, definitely. But family. You're something else. A commander who treats them like equipment that deserves proper maintenance." Django moved toward the exit. "Not sure which approach produces better soldiers, but I know which one produces survivors." 20 seconds. HUNK and Django reached the corridor simultaneously, moving with synchronized tactical awareness despite never having trained together. The demolition charges countdown was now audible, a soft electronic tone that most beings couldn't hear, but that both trained operatives' enhanced hearing detected clearly. "Why are you really here?" Django asked as they navigated through evacuating Kaminoans. "Not just to destroy research. You could have done that from orbit. You came back to Kamino for something specific. Information about who commissioned the behavioral modification chips implanted in every clone trooper." HUNK's tone remained flat, but Django's professional instincts caught the implication. Behavioral modification chips. The Kaminoans put control devices in the clones' brains. Order 66 programmed instruction to execute the Jedi on transmitted command. Every clone carries it. Most don't know it exists. HUNK reached the exterior platform, rain hammering down from Kamino's perpetual storm. The one who commissioned those chips is Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. Django stopped moving. "The Chancellor, the Republic's leader. You're saying he's planning to use the clone army to kill the Jedi?" "I'm saying he commissioned the mechanism to do so. Whether he activates it is tactical calculation I can't predict." HUNK moved toward his infiltration craft, a modified Republic shuttle he'd appropriated. "But the capability exists, and capabilities exist to be used." The demolition charges detonated. The deep laboratory complex collapsed in a controlled implosion, taking the prototype super soldiers and decades of genetic research into Kamino's ocean depths. The surface facility remained intact. HUNK had been precise with his charge placement. Only the weaponized cloning program died. The standard clone production continued undisturbed. Django watched the destruction with professional appreciation. You just cost the Kaminoans more money than most planetary governments spend in a year. They'll hunt you for this. They'll try. They'll fail. HUNK boarded his shuttle. You should consider what happens when Order 66 activates. You've trained those clones. You've worked alongside Jedi generals. When the Chancellor transmits the order, every clone will turn on every Jedi simultaneously. No warning, no hesitation, just execution. Why tell me this? Because you're not my enemy. You're a displaced template who might have useful skills when the galaxy collapses. HUNK initiated launch sequence. And because 3 million clones are going to need guidance from someone who understands Mandalorian combat doctrine after I've finished teaching them Umbrella Corporation Special Forces methodology. The shuttle lifted off, disappearing into Kamino's storm before Republic security could respond. Jango Fett stood on the platform, watching it vanish, processing revelations that shattered his understanding of the clone program he'd helped create. Order 66, behavioral modification chips, the Chancellor orchestrating betrayal, and a silent operative from another dimension who treated clone troopers like valuable equipment instead of disposable soldiers. Django had been replaced as clone template, had lost the army that should have carried his genetics. But maybe, just maybe, the replacement had been an improvement after all. Because HUNK was right about one thing. When the galaxy collapsed and the Clone Wars ended, 3 million clone troopers were going to need more than combat training. They were going to need survival skills, and the Grim Reaper was the best survival instructor the galaxy would ever see. In orbit above Kamino, HUNK transmitted the encrypted files to his network of chip-free clone commanders. They needed to know the truth, needed to understand that Palpatine had been orchestrating everything from the beginning, needed to prepare for the moment when Order 66 would transmit and 3 million brothers would become murderers. The message was simple. The Chancellor is the enemy. The chips are weapons. Remove them where possible. Prepare for activation. Protect Jedi who've earned loyalty. Survive what's coming. 17 clone commanders received the transmission. 17 commanders who could now make independent decisions. 17 nodes in a network that would choose resistance over programming when the order came. It wasn't enough to save the Jedi Order. It wasn't enough to stop Order 66, but it was enough to create chaos in what was meant to be a perfectly coordinated purge. And in chaos, there was survival opportunity. The Grim Reaper had learned that lesson in Raccoon City, in Rockford Island, in a dozen other hellscapes where he'd been the only survivor. Now he was teaching it to an army of clones who shared his genetics and would soon share his greatest skill, surviving when everyone else dies. The Galactic Empire rose from the Republic's ashes with terrifying efficiency, and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, now Emperor Palpatine, wasted no time consolidating absolute power. The Senate was dissolved. The Jedi were declared traitors, and the clone army that had served the Republic was repurposed as the instrument of Imperial control. But cracks were forming in that instrument, cracks that HUNK had deliberately created. 6 months after Order 66, the Empire discovered a problem. Approximately 4% of clone troopers were exhibiting aberrant behavioral patterns. They questioned orders that violated military ethics. They hesitated when commanded to execute civilians. They showed initiative that deviated from programmed responses. Imperial command attributed it to genetic drift, to accelerated aging causing neural degradation. They began phasing out clone troopers in favor of recruited human soldiers, stormtroopers who could be indoctrinated rather than programmed. They never suspected the truth that 4% represented every clone who'd received chip removal, plus those who'd been trained by chip-free commanders to think independently. HUNK monitored the Empire's transition from a hidden facility on Ord Mantell, a world forgotten by Imperial oversight, perfect for establishing an operation base. The facility had been a Republic listening post during the war. Now it served as command center for something the Empire would consider far more dangerous than rebel cells: the Ghost Protocol, a network of chip-free clone troopers who deserted Imperial service, bringing with them weapons, intelligence, and most importantly, other clones who were beginning to question their purpose. Commander Rex stood at the tactical display, reviewing deployment reports from cells across the galaxy. We have confirmed networks on 18 worlds now, approximately 2,000 clone deserters, another 5,000 still serving but sympathetic to our cause. The Empire hasn't connected the pattern yet, but when they do, they'll purge suspected elements, HUNK completed, which is why extraction operations must accelerate. Priority targets: chip-free commanders, specialized personnel, clones with skills beyond infantry combat. Commander Wolf, who joined the network after witnessing Imperial atrocities on Ryloth, pulled up casualty reports. The Empire is using clone troopers as expendable assets, worse than the Republic did. Garrison duty in hostile territory with no support, frontline suppression against civilian populations, suicide missions against rebel cells. They're deliberately burning through the clone army. Cost reduction, HUNK analyzed. Clone maintenance is expensive. Recruited stormtroopers are cheaper. The Empire is liquidating assets it no longer needs. They're killing us off, Rex said bluntly. Systematically. We helped them win the war, and now they're throwing us away because we're obsolete equipment. HUNK had predicted this outcome months ago, had warned the clone commanders that their service would end with decommissioning or deliberate disposal. The clones hadn't wanted to believe it. Now they were watching it happen in real time. "What about the Jedi survivors?" Commander Bly asked, entering the command center with a holographic data chip. "We've confirmed 37 younglings from the Temple extraction survived. They're scattered, hiding, some in danger of discovery, and there are maybe 200 other Jedi across the galaxy who escaped Order 66. Imperial Inquisitors are hunting them systematically. Not our mission," HUNK said. "Clone survival is priority. Jedi preservation is secondary objective, if it doesn't compromise primary." "What if it's the same objective?" Rex challenged. "The Jedi are being hunted by Imperial forces. We have intelligence networks, safe houses, extraction capabilities. We could help them." "To what end?" HUNK asked. "The Jedi Order is destroyed. Survivors are fugitives with no organization, no resources, no ability to resist the Empire. Protecting them expends assets without achieving strategic advantage." "Maybe strategic advantage isn't the point," Rex countered. "Maybe doing the right thing is the point." HUNK studied Rex with the same analytical detachment he applied to every tactical problem. The clone had changed since chip removal, had developed ethical frameworks beyond mission completion, had embraced concepts like honor and righteousness that HUNK recognized as luxuries survivors couldn't afford. But Rex wasn't wrong. The clone commanders with removed chips had become something beyond programmed soldiers. They'd become individuals who made choices based on principles rather than orders, which meant HUNK's intervention had succeeded beyond original parameters. He'd wanted independent thinkers who could survive without command structure. He'd created soldiers who cared about more than survival. New mission parameters, HUNK said, making a tactical decision that would define the Ghost Protocol's future. Primary objective, clone extraction and survival. Secondary objective, Jedi survivor assistance where feasible. Tertiary objective, intelligence gathering on Imperial operations. All objectives pursued with operational security as overriding concern. "You're agreeing to help the Jedi?" Wolf asked, surprised. "I'm acknowledging that clone morale requires purpose beyond pure survival. Protecting Jedi provides purpose while building networks that serve primary objectives." HUNK pulled up star charts showing Imperial Inquisitor movements. "We'll establish underground railroad for Force-sensitive refugees, safe houses, false identities, extraction routes. Jedi help us by providing Force-assisted intelligence gathering and combat support for high-risk operations." "That's actually a good plan," Bly admitted. "Use Jedi abilities for reconnaissance and protection while we provide the logistical infrastructure they lack." "It's also dangerous," Commander Cody noted, joining the discussion. "The Inquisitors are former Jedi themselves. They know how to hunt Force sensitives. If they track one Jedi to our network, they'll unravel everything." "Acceptable risk," HUNK assessed. "The intelligence value of Force-sensitive operatives exceeds the compromise probability, and the Empire assumes surviving Jedi are isolated, not organized. They won't expect coordinated resistance." Rex brought up files on specific Jedi survivors who'd reached out to the clone network for help. "We have confirmed contact with Jedi Master Quinlan Voss, former Temple Instructor Sindralig's Padawan Sarakito, and 3 former Temple Guards. They're offering to share Imperial intelligence in exchange for extraction assistance." "Accept the offers," HUNK ordered. "Establish protocols for Jedi clone cooperation, security compartmentalization to prevent network exposure if any element is compromised." The discussion continued for another hour, planning operations that would have been impossible during the Republic. Then clone troopers had followed orders without question. Now they were building resistance networks that operated on initiative and improvisation. HUNK observed the commanders debate strategies, argue tactics, make decisions independently. This was what successful training produced. Operatives who no longer needed constant command, who could adapt to changing circumstances, who valued survival but understood that survival sometimes required risk for larger objectives. The Ghost Protocol was becoming something he hadn't originally intended. Not just a survival network, but a resistance organization that preserved both clones and the values the Republic had claimed to represent. 3 months later, on the Imperial facility world of Nur, Jedi Master Quinlan Voss knelt in restraints while Inquisitors prepared his interrogation. The Empire had finally captured one of the more elusive Jedi survivors, and they intended to extract information about other fugitives before executing him. The Inquisitors never saw the assault coming. HUNK led a strike team of 12 chip-free clone commandos through Nur's fortress walls, using infiltration tactics that made Republic Special Forces look amateur. They moved in absolute silence, neutralizing Imperial security without triggering alarms, reaching the detention level where Force-sensitive prisoners were held. The Inquisitors detected their presence too late. By the time the former Jedi responded to intruders in their facility, HUNK's team had already extracted Quinlan Vos and two other captured Jedi, planted demolition charges in the facility's main reactor, and established escape routes through maintenance systems the Empire didn't know existed. The fortress exploded as the strike team evacuated. 3 Inquisitors died in the collapse. The Empire lost a primary interrogation facility and the captured Jedi who should have been intelligence assets. And across the galaxy, Jedi in hiding received a message through covert channels. The clones weren't all enemies. Some clones remembered loyalty. Some clones offered sanctuary. The Underground Railroad expanded. More Jedi survivors made contact. More clone deserters joined the network, and HUNK's Ghost Protocol transformed from survival operation into something that genuinely threatened Imperial control. Emperor Palpatine took notice. His intelligence agencies began investigating reports of organized clone desertion. Imperial Inquisitors received new orders. Find the network, destroy it, execute everyone involved. But HUNK had been evading corporate manhunts and government kill teams since before the Empire existed. He knew how to operate in shadows, how to compartmentalize operations, so compromise of one cell didn't expose others, how to stay invisible even when enemies knew you existed. The Grim Reaper had survived Umbrella Corporation's collapse, Raccoon City's bioweapon outbreak, and dimensional displacement into an alien galaxy. The Galactic Empire was just another threat to adapt to, another challenge to overcome through superior tactics and absolute professionalism. In his throne room on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine studied reports that should have been routine: minor clone desertion incidents, isolated Jedi sightings, small-scale resistance activities. But his mastery of the dark side let him see patterns that conventional analysis missed. "Someone is organizing them," he said to Darth Vader, who stood at attention in his life support armor. The clones and the Jedi survivors, someone with tactical expertise beyond what either group possesses independently. The clone commanders received military training, Vader suggested, his mechanized voice emotionless. Perhaps one retained enough independence to establish resistance networks. No, this is different. The operations show sophistication that exceeds clone training, infiltration techniques that aren't Republic doctrine. Someone from outside our military tradition is directing them. Palpatine pulled up footage from the Nur facility assault, grainy, damaged by the explosion, but showing glimpses of the strike team. One figure moved differently from the clone commandos. Same armor aesthetic, but movement patterns that were wrong. Too efficient, too precise, too professional, even for elite clone operators. "There," Palpatine indicated the figure. "That's the key. Find him and we destroy the network." "What makes you certain it's a him?" Vader asked. "Because," Palpatine said with dark certainty, "I sense nothing. No force presence. No connection to the living energy of the galaxy. Whoever that is, they don't exist in the Force. They're a void, a blank space where a person should be." The Emperor had sensed similar voids before, creatures and beings that existed outside the Force's influence, that couldn't be detected through dark side senses. But those had been ancient horrors, things from the unknown regions. This was something else, something that operated with technological precision rather than mystical power. "Find this ghost," Palpatine commanded. "Learn its identity, discover how it's corrupting my clone troopers, and eliminate it." Vader bowed. "As you wish, my master." HUNK received word of increased Imperial scrutiny through his intelligence networks. The Empire was actively hunting him now, had elevated the Ghost Protocol from minor nuisance to priority threat. Standard escalation pattern. He'd seen it before with Umbrella Corporation when they'd realized he was extracting data and survivors from their failed operations. The response was tactical adjustment, deeper operational security, more aggressive counterintelligence, strategic relocations of network assets. The Empire could hunt all they wanted. They were looking for someone who'd spent decades being invisible to organizations with better resources and technology. He stood in the command center on Ord Mantell, reviewing deployment protocols with Rex and the other commanders. The Ghost Protocol had grown beyond his original vision. What started as clone survival operation had become resistance movement that preserved both clone troopers and Jedi while disrupting Imperial operations. "We're changing the galaxy," Rex said, reviewing recent successes. Not winning, maybe, not defeating the Empire, but creating spaces where freedom can survive, where clones can live as individuals instead of serial numbers, where Jedi can practice the Force without execution. "We're creating survival opportunities," HUNK corrected. "Strategic advantage through asymmetric warfare and intelligence superiority." "You keep saying that," Rex observed, "but we both know it's more. You care. Maybe not the way normal people care, but you've chosen to protect us, to give us purpose beyond serving empires and chancellors." HUNK considered this assessment with characteristic detachment. He'd entered this galaxy pursuing dimensional research, had agreed to clone template status to secure resources, had woken to find himself responsible for 3 million soldiers. Every decision since had been tactical adaptation to changing circumstances. But Rex wasn't entirely wrong. Somewhere in the process of keeping clones alive, teaching them to think independently, creating networks that gave them purpose, HUNK had developed something approaching investment in their survival beyond pure asset management. "Professional standards," HUNK said finally, maintaining the explanation that had defined his actions. "Assets must be preserved. Operations must succeed. Personnel under my command survive." "Then we're your command now?" Rex smiled. "The Grim Reaper has an army after all." "A network," HUNK corrected. "Decentralized, compartmentalized, resilient against compromise. Not an army. An organization built for survival rather than conquest." "What do we call it?" "The Ghost Protocol is operational designation. But if we're building something permanent..." HUNK had already calculated this necessity. Organizations required identity, needed names that operatives could rally around. The Ghost Protocol had served initial purposes, but what came next required different designation. "Hive Protocol," he said, the acronym forming as he spoke. "Hostile environment independent volunteer extraction. Operational focus, extract assets from Imperial control. Provide independence to volunteers who reject Imperial service. We're not rebels fighting the Empire. We're survivors creating alternatives to Empire control." "Hive Protocol," Rex tested the name. "I like it. Clear mission statement. Defines what we are without claiming to be rebellion. We're extraction and preservation, not conquest and liberation." The commanders approved the designation. Hive Protocol would become their identity, their purpose, their organization that existed outside Imperial control and Rebel Alliance ideology. Pure survival operation at galactic scale. HUNK had entered this galaxy as lone survivor seeking return home. Now he commanded organization that protected thousands. The mission parameters had changed. The objectives had evolved. But the core principle remained absolute. Complete the mission. Survive. Ensure your people survive. Everything else was tactical detail. The demolition charges detonated precisely on schedule, and Tipoca City's cloning facilities collapsed into Kamino's endless ocean. The genetic archives that held HUNK's DNA, the growth chambers that had produced 3 million soldiers, the research laboratories that had weaponized his survival instinct, all of it sank beneath the waves, erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. HUNK watched the destruction with professional detachment, then turned away. The contract was terminated. The mission parameters had finally achieved clarity. He would never return to his dimension. The Kaminoans' research had proven that dimensional travel was beyond even their advanced technology, but that failure had ceased to matter months ago, when he'd stopped being a stranded operative and become something else. The template who refused to let his clones be wasted. The Ghost Protocol expanded across the Empire's territories like a virus the Emperor couldn't detect. Former clone troopers with removed chips operated in shadows, extracting brothers from Imperial service, protecting Jedi survivors, creating networks that preserved what the Republic had claimed to value. They moved with HUNK's tactical doctrine, survived with his methodologies, and operated by the professional standards he'd drilled into every commander he'd trained. Commander Rex led the clone resistance cells with competence that would have made any Special Forces instructor proud. Commander Cody established safe houses that Imperial intelligence couldn't penetrate. Commander Wolf trained new operatives in survival tactics that exceeded anything the Kaminoans had programmed. And across the galaxy, 2,000 former clones lived as proof that manufactured soldiers could become free individuals when given the choice. The Empire hunted them. Inquisitors tracked Jedi survivors who relied on clone protection networks. Darth Vader personally investigated reports of the Ghost Trooper, the legendary operative who'd corrupted Imperial property and created resistance from programmed obedience. They found nothing. HUNK had spent decades evading organizations with better resources than the Empire. He was invisible because invisibility was survival. The 37 Jedi younglings extracted from the temple grew into something the galaxy had never seen. Force sensitives trained by clone commandos rather than Jedi masters, combining force abilities with tactical doctrine that emphasized survival over philosophy. They would become the next generation of force users, pragmatic, efficient, and utterly unwilling to repeat the mistakes that had destroyed their order. HUNK operated from the shadows as he'd always done, completing missions that kept the Ghost Protocol functional. He trained operatives. He eliminated threats. He ensured that clones bearing his genetics survived in a galaxy designed to dispose of them. It wasn't the life he'd planned when he'd entered that Umbrella facility years ago, but planning had never been his strength. Adaptation was. The mission had evolved beyond recognition. He'd come seeking dimensional travel and been given an army. He'd accepted cloning as a transaction and been made responsible for 3 million lives. He'd woken to find his genetics weaponized and responded by teaching weapons to think for themselves. Now he stood at the center of a resistance that would outlive him, that would continue operating according to professional standards he'd instilled, that would preserve both clone and Jedi survivors through the Empire's darkest years. The Ghost Protocol had become self-sustaining, resilient, exactly what survival organizations needed to be. Emperor Palpatine had created the clone army to eliminate the Jedi and establish absolute control. Instead, he'd given the galaxy 3 million potential insurgents who shared the genetics of the most prolific survivor in galactic history. Some still served the Empire, programmed and loyal, but thousands had been freed from that programming, taught to question orders, trained to survive independently. And every one of them carried HUNK's DNA, his adaptive physiology, his resistance to impossible odds, his absolute refusal to accept defeat or abandonment of personnel under his command. The Grim Reaper had entered the Star Wars galaxy by accident. He'd become the template for the Clone Wars by circumstance, and he'd evolved into something the Empire would never eliminate. The operator who taught disposable soldiers that they were worth saving, that survival was possible, that professional standards meant protecting your people no matter what orders said otherwise. The galaxy would never know his name. The clones would remember him only as the Ghost Trooper, the legend who intervened when death seemed certain. The Jedi survivors would speak of the silent protector who'd saved younglings from the temple purge, and the Empire would hunt a phantom who existed in reports, but never in evidence. HUNK preferred it that way. Names were irrelevant. Legacy was a luxury survivors couldn't afford. What mattered was mission completion, asset preservation, and the knowledge that 3 million clones now had the choice he'd fought to give them: serve or survive, follow orders or make decisions, die as programmed weapons or live as free individuals. The mission parameters were finally clear. The objectives were defined. And the Grim Reaper would continue operating until operational capability ceased, training clones, protecting survivors, disrupting Imperial control through asymmetric warfare that the Emperor's forces could never fully counter, because professional standards had to mean something, even in a galaxy far, far away, even when fighting a war that wasn't his own, even when protecting soldiers who were copies of a man who'd stopped being human long before the cloning began. Winter had come to Umbrella Corporation. The Grim Reaper had survived. Order 66 had come to the clone army. The Ghost Trooper had intervened, and whatever came next, rebellion, empire, chaos, or collapse, HUNK would adapt, survive, and ensure his people did the same. One mission at a time, one clone saved at a time, one professional standard maintained at a time. The mission was complete. The new mission was beginning, and the Grim Reaper always completed his missions.